Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear viewers. I am Professor Dr. Muhammad Usman, and today we are going to discuss various properties of the action potential or nerve fibers. So various properties are latent period, all or none law, refractory period, conduction velocity, coding for the stimulus intensity, then strength, duration, curve, compound action potential, then effect of other ions on the action potential, means other than the sodium and potassium, then there is property of PLAB in some action potentials, and finally rhythmicity. So let us start with the latent period. So by definition, latent period is the period between the application of the stimulus, application of the stimulus and appearance of the response. So this period is called latent period, as you can see here. So basically this is the graph of an action potential, and here you can see this is the resting membrane stage, and here the stimulus has been applied. Here the stimulus, as the arrow indicates, has been applied. So the stimulus leads to this local potential, and here comes the threshold level or the firing level, and when the neuron fires, so we get the depolarization phase. So by definition this is the period on the x axis, on the time scale, between the application of the stimulus and appearance of response or depolarization, which is called latent period. Next is very important property of the action potentials, which is called all or none law. By definition it means that on the application of a stimulus, an excitable cell membrane, whether of a axon or whether of a muscle, it either responds with a full-fledged action potential which will spread along the membrane, or it will not respond at all with an action potential. किसी भी स्टिमुलस के अप्लाई करने पे या तो एक्शन पोटेंशियल प्रोड्यूस होगी और वो स्प्रेड भी करेगी, या फिर बिल्कुल नहीं होगी. ठीक है. सो दिस प्रॉपर्टी इज कॉल्ड ऑल और नॉन लॉ. दिस इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. All or none law is very important because it helps the nervous system to discriminate between important and unimportant events. The stimuli which are too weak to bring the membrane to the threshold, they do not fire an action potential, they do not induce an action potential, and therefore they do not disturb the nervous system by transmitting these insignificant signals. So only those signals are transmitted to the nervous system which are significant enough, and they have the capability to produce an action potential. Next property is called refractory period, and it is of two types, that is absolute and relative. So first of all, absolute refractory period, it is the period during which no stimulus can produce a second or new action potential in an already excited tissue, no matter how strong the stimulus is. It is the period during which no stimulus can produce a second or new action potential in an already excited tissue, no matter how much is the strength of stimulus. So this period, as you can see here, it corresponds to the entire period of the depolarization. This absolute refractory period, it corresponds to the entire period of the depolarization and most of the repolarization phase. So entire period of depolarization and most of the repolarization phase, from here to here, almost from here to here, this is the absolute refractory period. In myelinated nerve fibers, its value is about 1/2500 seconds. Its value in myelinated nerve fibers is 1/2500 seconds. Now refractory period in different excitable tissues is different. In cardiac muscle, its value is something else. In smooth muscles, in axons, its value is something else. So during this period, the membrane becomes completely refractory or stubborn or unresponsive to any further stimulation. So that is why it is called absolute refractory period. So what are the bases of absolute refractory period? Basically, during this period, during the period of absolute refractory period, the sodium channels, which are the major channels responsible for the depolarization, they still not have reset to their original position. Okay. So, this is the original position of the voltage gated sodium channels, in which their activation gate is closed and inactivation gate is open. So, this is the period during which the sodium channels are not in this state, rather they are either in this state. This is the state during depolarization. This is the state of the voltage gated sodium channels during depolarization, during which their activation gate is open and inactivation gate is also open. That is why the sodium is entering inside and producing depolarization. Or the sodium channels are in this state. This is the state of the sodium channels during most of the repolarization, in which their inactivation gate is closed, and due to closure of the inactivation gate, no sodium can enter and can produce any depolarization. So, this is the basis of absolute refractory period, that is the sodium channels have still not reset to their original position. Their original position will be restored when the membrane potential will reach near or to the resting stage. So, then there is relative refractory period. Now, during this period, a second action potential can be generated in an already excited tissue, but the condition is that the strength of the stimulus should be more than normal. So, we can say that this is the period during which a supra threshold stimulus, it is the stimulus whose strength is more than normal. So, this is the period during which a supra threshold stimulus can produce an action potential in an already excited tissue. Okay. So, this is called relative refractory period. It corresponds almost to the last half of the repolarization. As you can see here, from here the relative refractory period starts, and we can say that it corresponds to the last half of the repolarization plus this hyperpolarization phase. So, hyperpolarization phase is also included in the relative refractory period. And what are the bases of the relative refractory period? It is because some of the sodium channels, they have reset to their original position. Okay. During the last half of the repolarization and during this hyperpolarization, as you can see below, some of the sodium channels, they have reset to their original position, that is their activation gates are closed, while during this phase the potassium channels are still open. So, a stimulus whose strength is equal to the normal stimulus, it will not be able to produce a new action potential. But if we apply a stimulus whose strength is more than the normal, then it can produce influx of the enough sodium ions through this voltage gated sodium channels. The stimulus will act on these already set voltage gated sodium channels. It will cause their opening, it will cause influx of the sodium ions, and it will lead to a second action potential. So, that is why we need a supra threshold stimulus. Then the next property is called conduction velocity, and conduction velocity of axon, it depends upon two factors. Number one, diameter of the axon. Okay. Larger is the diameter of the axon, more will be the velocity of impulse in the axon. So, larger axon, they conduct impulses at faster rates, while smaller axon, they conduct impulses or action potentials at low speeds. Okay. It is just because of the diameter of the axon. And the second thing on which the conduction velocity of an impulse or action potential depends, it is myelination. Okay. We know that in the myelinated nerve fibers, as you can see here, there is saltatory conduction or jumping. The impulse jumps in this manner from here to here to here. So, this jumping manner, it increases the conduction velocity of action potential or impulse. Next property of the action potential or nerve fiber is coding for stimulus intensity. Now, this simply means that how our brain, it gets to know the strength of the stimulus or about the stimulus intensity, because the only message which the brain is receiving is action potential, and all action potentials are alike. Basically, this is done by the frequency of discharge of impulses. Now, strong stimulus, it will generate impulses at higher frequency and vice versa. So, the more the number of impulses the brain receives, it knows that the strength of stimulus is high or more than normal. Then the next property is called strength duration curve. Basically, it is a graph, and this graph shows us two factors. Number one, voltage or current strength of the stimulus applied, and number two, as the name indicates, duration of the stimulus. So, this graph shows us these two properties or factors about the stimulus, that is voltage of the stimulus and duration of the stimulus. So, there are three important terminologies or things which we draw from this graph, that is strength duration curve. Number one, it gives information about the rheobase. Now, rheobase, what is rheobase? Rheobase is basically the minimum strength of the stimulus, or you can say the minimum voltage of the stimulus, which when applied for an adequately prolonged time will produce an action potential. Okay? It is the minimum strength of the stimulus which when applied for an adequate time, it will lead to production of an action potential. Then other terminology is utilization time. Basically, this is the time, it is, we can say it is the minimum time for which when a stimulus equal to the rheobase value, okay, the strength of the stimulus should be equal to the rheobase value, which when applied it will produce an action potential. So, utilization time, it is the time for which when a stimulus equal to the rheobase value when applied, it will lead to the firing of the neuron or it will produce an action potential. You will have a better understanding in the next slide, which has a graph. Okay. Chronaxie. Chronaxie is also a time, and we can say that it is the minimum time for which when a stimulus equal to twice the rheobase value, okay, the strength of the stimulus should be twice the rheobase value. It is when applied, it produce an action potential. Okay. So, minimum time for which when a stimulus equal to the twice the rheobase value when applied, it produces an action potential. Of course, tissues which are more excitable, they have a shorter chronaxie and vice versa. So, this is the typical strength duration curve. As you can see, this green colored, it is the strength duration curve. On the x axis we have time or duration, and on the y axis we have strength or voltage of the stimulus applied. Okay. So, this is the strength duration curve, and this is showing us rheobase and utilization time and also chronaxie. So, please look at this graph and try to figure out these three values, that is what is the rheobase, what is the utilization time and what is the chronaxie. Take few seconds and you can easily predict. Yes. So, the value of utilization time from this graph, it is about 1 millisecond. Okay. So, it is the minimum time for which when a stimulus equal to the rheobase value, here we have firing, okay, here is the firing level. So, this is 1 millisecond, okay, it is touching the x axis here. So, 1 millisecond, it is the utilization time, minimum time for which when a stimulus equal to the rheobase value, this is the rheobase value, when applied it will producing an action potential. So, of course, from here we also get the rheobase value, and rheobase value is this is 0.6 millivolts, because this intersects the y axis at this 0.6 millivolts value, okay, almost 0.6 millivolts. Then the third value which we can determine from this graph is chronaxie, and chronaxie is about 0.19 milliseconds. Okay. So, this is the chronaxie, because when we apply a stimulus equal to twice the rheobase value was 0.6 and this is 0.12, twice the rheobase value. So, when stimulus equal to twice the rheobase value has been applied, okay, then we get the chronaxie. How much time this stimulus was applied? It was applied for about 0.19 or you can say 0.2 almost milliseconds, then it is able to get a response. So, these are the three important values which we can get from this graph, which is called strength duration curve. Now, the next property is compound action potential. By definition, an action potential having more than one peak or spike, it is called a compound action potential. So, such an action potential is never recorded from a single axon or nerve fiber, but it is always recorded from a nerve or nerve trunk. It is because the nerve or nerve trunk, it contains many different types of nerve fibers, and these different types of nerve fibers, they vary widely in their excitability and speeds of conduction of action potential. So, multiple peaks are recorded, as you can see here in this graph. Okay. Multiple peaks are recorded in compound action potential, with the action potential from the fastest conducting nerve fiber to be recorded first of all, and it is followed by the slower ones. So, the first peak is recorded from the A alpha fibers, which are the fastest conducting. Then the second peak is recorded from the A beta fibers, whose velocity is less than A alpha fibers. Then this peak is recorded from the A gamma fibers, which have excitability and speed of conduction less than the A beta fibers. So, these are A gamma fibers. Then the next property is effect of other ions on the action potential. Other ions means other than the sodium and potassium ions. So, here we will discuss two important ions and their effect on the action potential, that is number 1 anions, which are present inside the cell, and secondly we will discuss the effect of calcium ions. So, anions are impermeant, they are strictly inside the confined to inside of the cell and they cannot move out. They are basically responsible for the negative charge inside the nerve fiber or axon, because when there is net deficit of the positively charged potassium ions and other positive ions, then these anions will give negative charge to this axonal membrane or axolemma. Okay. Then second is the calcium ions, and calcium ions number 1, in some tissues they produce action potential. Instead of the sodium, they cause action potential, like in the cardiac muscle, in some portion of the cardiac muscle, and also in smooth muscle. These calcium ions, they produce action potential instead of sodium ions. And second is the effect of their deficiency. Okay. When the calcium ions are deficient, the condition is called hypocalcemia. So, what is the effect of hypocalcemia on the action potential? Okay. So, basically what happens that when there is deficit of the calcium ions in the ECF, the permeability of the voltage gated sodium channels to the sodium ion is increased. So, voltage gated sodium channels, which are responsible for the depolarization phase, they take in more sodium is passed through these channels. So, we say that the nerve fiber becomes highly excitable. Okay. In this condition, the sodium channels are opened by very little change in the membrane potential. A little change occurs in the membrane potential and sodium channels are opened. So, we can say that the nerve fiber becomes highly excitable. So, this highly excitable axon or nerve fiber, it can lead to the muscle tetany. Okay. As you can see here, this is the sign of muscle tetany, and these are two very important signs of the tetany, which results from hypocalcemia. Then the next property is plateau, which is observed in some action potentials and it is not present in all the action potentials. The potential remains on a plateau near the peak of the spike for many milliseconds, and only then the repolarization phase begins. As you can see here, this is a picture of cardiac muscle action potential, and this is the plateau phase. Okay. This is the resting state, then this is depolarization, and this is initial repolarization, and this is plateau phase, and then this is final repolarization, and then again this is resting state. So, this is the plateau phase. Okay. Plateau phase, because here the action potential has remained on the plateau for many milliseconds. In cardiac muscle, the plateau lasts for as long as about 0.2 to 0.3 seconds, and it causes contraction of the heart muscle to last for this same long period. Okay. It causes sufficient contraction of the heart muscle. Then the question arises that what is the cause of the plateau phase? Basically, the potential is neither rising upward, you can say, you are clearly seeing here the potential has remained static on at this stage, okay, at this level. It is neither rising upward nor it is coming down. So basically it is caused by the slow calcium influx. There is slow calcium influx through the voltage gated calcium channels, and also there is slow potassium efflux or outflux through the voltage gated potassium channels. So कैल्शियम इनसाइड आ रहा है और पोटेशियम बाहर जा रहा है, इसीलिए प्लेटो जो है वो यहाँ पर स्टैटिक है, ना ये ऊपर जाता है ना ये नीचे आ रहा है. कैल्शियम आयंस का इन्फ्लक्स हो रहा है और पोटेशियम आयंस का इफ्लक्स हो रहा है. सो दिस इज द बेसिक काज ऑफ प्लेटो फेज. Then the next property of the action potential is rhythmicity, and this is the final property. Rhythmicity basically means regularly repetitive action potentials. Okay, regularly repetitive action potential or discharge, this property is called rhythmicity. Okay, this occurs normally in many places of the body, like it occurs in the heart and it causes rhythmical beating of the heart. In some smooth muscle also rhythmicity occurs, and for example in the intestinal smooth muscle, and it causes peristaltic contractions. Then in many neurons of the CNS rhythmicity occurs, and it causes, for example, rhythmical control of our breathing. So what is the cause of the rhythmicity? The cause of the rhythmicity is more than normal permeability of these excitable membranes to the positive ions, even in the resting stage. That is, even in the resting stage the excitable membrane is permeable to the, more than normal permeable to the sodium ions. So with this we have discussed all the properties of the action potentials or nerve fibers. Hope you would have understood these properties. Please feel free to ask any questions in the comment section or by sending me an email if you have any query. Thank you for watching this video. Stay blessed. Allah Hafiz.